Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 6, Lesson 2, and this is going to be community ecology. Like we talked about in class, a suggestion that we had for everyone to kind of help you study a little bit easier is to read the textbook first and then watch the video and do your sticky notes. So our study tip for today is read the section and answer the guided reading questions before watching the video and taking sticky notes. Okay, so then the sticky notes should serve as a summary of what you read, and hopefully through the video you will be able to kind of understand things better in case anything was confusing to you at that time. All right, so the reading for today is going to be page 161, which we're on right now, where it says Community Ecologists Study Species Interactions. So right here on this page. Okay, all the way to the checkpoint question. So you'll see where we stop on page 168. So let's get started with our sticky note summary. All right, so first we have species interactions in a community, okay, and so that's what we're going to kind of summarize as community ecology. And to help understand what species are going to be in an area are determined by a couple of different factors. First is the range of abiotic conditions it can tolerate. So some species can tolerate a large range of conditions like temperature or salinity if you're a fish, or pH and things like that. We talked about niches, and that's kind of where the niches come in. Number 2 is going to be able to disperse or spread out without human interference. So if you're a flower and you're in a field, will you be able to spread your genetics? If you are a lion in the Sahara or the Serengeti, will you be able to spread out in places that you need without coming across humans or getting hunted by humans or getting chopped down if you're a tree by humans? And then number 3 is interactions with other species. So all of these together kind of make up this term called community ecology. Okay, so basically these 3 factors work together and kind of determine if a species is going to be able to live in a habitat or not. All right, now first we're going to study something called competition. And if you remember the paramecium experiment from the last lesson, the same scientist actually did another paramecium experiment, and his second question was, how do different paramecium species affect each other's growth? So this was an experiment in competition. His first experiment, the 2 species were grown in independent environments, and both of them grew to fairly large populations. They kind of hit their carrying capacity and leveled off. All right. However, in the second experiment, they were grown in the same environment. One grew to the carrying capacity and the other basically died and went extinct. So if we want to look at these graphs real quick, this is the one where Aurelia is grown separately. It comes up exponential, levels off here at carrying capacity. Same over here with caudatum. It goes up, levels off at carrying capacity. But then when they're grown together, okay, as you can see, Aurelia is a much stronger competitor, and so it grew much higher. Caudatum kind of went up for a while and then got out-competed, and so ended up going down to extinction in this experiment. All right, so our definition of competition is the struggle of an individual to obtain a limiting resource. All right, so usually limiting resources in ecosystems can include food or availability of water or space to make a nest or something. I think we talked about that in the last lesson, limiting resources. They've come up with this, ecologists have come up with this competitive exclusion principle, which states that 2 species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So for the experiment that we just saw, kind of supported this principle, was that 2 species, they need the same things, one's going to outcompete the other. All right, now evolution and natural selection has kind of taken this competitive exclusion principle and gone and kind of ran with it into this resource partitioning idea. And so resource partitioning is the division of a resource based on behavior or morphology. And so this is driven by natural selection. So over generations and generations and generations, eventually two species competing for the same resource will partition the resource, which means kind of separate it or share it, without a better word, in order to make sure that the competition actually decreases. So if we look at this graph, okay, I kind of made figure 615 into this summary graph. And so this is an example of resource partitioning. So there's two species, maybe let's call them birds, and one of them is a strong competitor, one of them is a weak competitor. So the strong competitor really likes to eat small and medium-sized seeds. The weaker competitor likes to eat medium to large seeds. And now competition occurs where the preferences overlap. So in this kind of area by the medium seeds, this is where the strongest competition happens. Now, after lots of generations of natural selection, eventually the weaker species is going to evolve to not eat the medium-sized seeds in order to reduce competition. So now the strong population is going to be the same, and then the weaker species has actually just kind of scooted over and kind of limited their preferences for the medium-sized seeds. That way they don't have to worry about it. So if we take a look at this figure, kind of like I said before, when two individuals of species 2 competes with species 1 for medium seeds, individuals of species 2 experience poor survival and reproduction. Okay, so anybody who favors this, that's part of species 2, will probably not survive to reproduce. All right, so as a result, natural selection will favor those individuals of species 2 that do not compete for medium-sized seeds with species 1. So the favorable species for this favorable individuals for species 2 will be the more likely to reproduce because they're not competing with species 1. So eventually, after several generations, species 2 evolves to reduce its overlap in seed size consumption with species 1. Okay, and eventually then everybody's happy. Now, there's a couple of different ways that organisms in different environments do this thing called resource partitioning. So first is going to be temporal, and it's not temperature, it's actually time. Okay, like tempo, if you're into music, tempo is beats, usually per minute. And so temporal is going to be reducing competition by using a resource at different times. So our example of this is going to be over here, wolves and coyotes here at the top. They usually live in similar environments, but they try to stay out of each other's territories. And in addition, wolves tend to be more active in the early evening, where coyotes tend to be more active from midnight until dawn. Okay, so wolves are kind of during dusk, and coyotes are going to be almost completely nocturnal. All right. Next, we have spatial. Actually, I can just move this over here so we can see them at the same time. Okay, so next we have spatial. These species reduce competition by using different habitats. Our example of this one is going to be desert plants. So here's some two different desert plants. Plants in many desert habitats exhibit spatial resource partitioning. Tarbush, this guy, grows very deep roots to reach deep sources of water, whereas gramagrass over here has an extensive shallow root system that allows it to take up water rapidly during rare rain events. Okay, so this guy has shallow roots, it's probably going to grow along the surface here. This guy has super deep roots, so they're not competing for the same water source. Okay, and then last but not least is going to be morphological resource partitioning, and that's going to be the evolution of different body shapes and sizes. I wrote the example here is Galapagos finches. The example in the figure is a black-footed ferret and an ermine. Okay, and it says species of predatory weasels exhibit morphological resource partitioning. Differences in skull and tooth sizes allow each species to specialize on different sizes of prey. So obviously the ermine is going to be preying upon much smaller species than the black-footed ferret. All right. Next we have predation. Okay. Now predation is basically the use of one species as a resource by another species, and there's four main types. I know that most of us feel like true predators or true predation is going to be the only kind of predation, but if you didn't know, herbivory is actually a kind of predation, parasites is a kind of predation, and parasitoids is a kind of predation. Okay, so I just divided my sticky notes into four. So true predators is the one that you normally think of when someone says predator. They kill the prey and then they consume it, like lions or owls. Okay, they kill their prey and then they eat it. Next we have herbivores, and they consume plants as prey. Okay, it's a lot easier to catch a plant than it is a gazelle, but still, gazelles are herbivores as well as deer. Next we have parasites. They live in the organism they consume, and that's called a host. So the parasite lives inside a host, and like what we discovered on Friday during our lesson, parasites do not kill their host, because if their host dies, then they do too. All right. Now there's a special name for parasites that cause disease, and that's called a pathogen. Okay, so parasites that cause disease, they're like viruses, bacteria, fungi, tapeworms. Okay, some things like that they cause disease. So anything that causes a disease is called a pathogen. Okay, and then our last kind of predator is a parasitoid, and those are those crazy animals that they end up laying eggs in other organisms. A lot of fly species and wasp species especially are parasitoids. So gross, okay, but it's actually a form of predation, which is an interesting fact. All right, now predators are an essential part of ecosystems because they regulate prey populations. So I think that was one of our questions on our DOL this past week, was why do we need predators in ecosystems? And they actually help to regulate prey populations, make sure they're not overpopulating. All right, now in order to combat this kind of constant threat of predation, a lot of prey species have evolved defensive mechanisms in order to survive. So we have four types. We have behavioral, like hiding or being very still or running really fast. Okay, those are behavioral defenses to predation. We have morphological defenses like camouflage or spines, like on a porcupine. I'll show you in a second. We have chemical defenses like toxins or a bright color. Usually bright color means poison. And so I put a little star here that says mimicry. Some actually non-poisonous animals end up evolving a bright color to kind of mimic a toxic organism, and so it will kind of make predators not want to eat them so much. So in figure 617, we have these different prey defenses. This is a flounder fish, and he lives at the bottom of the sea, and so he kind of blends in with the bottom so that predators can't find him. Here's our little friend the porcupine, and he has thorns. This is a poison dart frog, and he has toxic skin. And if you look at this frog is actually looks extremely similar to the poison dart frog, but he actually is non-toxic. He's just mimicking. Okay, things like chameleons and things like that, they can mimic lots of different things. They use camouflage to their definite advantage. Okay, so now we have mutualism, and I know we talked about mutualism, commensalism, parasitism in class on Friday. So let's look at a few more examples of that today. So mutualism benefits two interacting species by increasing both species' chances of survival and reproduction. So I have a few examples here. Plants and pollinators. Plants get to perform reproduction and pollinators get food. Okay. Acacia trees and ants, which is in figure 618, if you'd like to take a look at that. The acacia trees have defense from other predators, and the ants have food and habitat. They eat the nectar, and they're able to actually live inside the acacia trees. Algae and coral. Algae is kind of what gives coral its life. Okay, and then algae gets a place to live and stay away from predators. fungus and alga and lichens is our picture right here in figure 619. So it says lichens, such as this species, are composed of fungus and an alga that are tightly linked together in a mutualistic interaction. The fungus provides nutrients to the alga, and the alga provides carbohydrates for the fungus via photosynthesis. Okay, so they both need each other. They both benefit, so that's why they are mutualistic. All right. Next, we have commensalism. Commensalism is where one species benefits, but the other isn't harmed nor helped. Okay. An example of this is going to be birds and trees. Birds get nesting areas and escape from predators, and the trees are not affected in any way. Coral and fish. The coral provides a hiding place from predators for the fish, and the coral are not harmed because most fish species do not eat coral. And so these kind of predation, parasitism, competition, mutualism, commensalism, these are all examples of this idea called symbiosis, or a symbiotic relationship. And so these are relationships of two species living in close association. So any two species that are living in the same community are going to have lots of these different kinds of symbiotic relationships. Okay, so being able to identify them and understand the results are going to be beneficial to many scientists. All right, so next we're going to talk about something called a keystone species. Okay, so keystone species are going to be those that play a role in an ecosystem far more important than the relative abundance says. So usually they are pretty low in numbers, but they are called keystone because of this architecture concept. And so whenever you build an arch of something, there's always a keystone, like an essential block in the arch, and so without that the whole thing crumbles. So the scientists have kind of taken that on from architecture and in being able to describe these species because they are so essential to these different ecosystems. All right, so our example of this is going to be a sea star, and we kind of talked about this during our Skittles lab. In intertidal communities have dozens of species, and you guys saw that in our Skittles lab. Now the sea stars prey on the mussel population because that's what they prefer to eat. Now without the sea star population, the mussels end up absolutely dominating and kind of driving out all the other species. However, with the sea star population, all populations are able to be balanced. And so while we might not need a bajillion sea stars, we need at least a few in order to keep that population balance. Okay, a couple more examples. We have a species that provides food for a community when food is scarce. So kind of an alternative food source is going to be essential whenever the food source decreases, and that happens in a lot of forest communities. Another example of keystone species is going to be a species with important mutualistic interactions with other species. For example, rare pollinators, mycorrhizal fungi, and they kind of live on plants' roots, and they increase the plant's ability to extract nutrients. Okay, so anything that has a mutualistic relationship is probably going to be a pretty keystone species in the community. All right, and next we have, or actually, we'd like to look at this graph really quick of these keystone predators. So sea stars are keystone predators in their rocky intertidal communities in Washington state. When sea stars are present, they consume mussels, which are strong competitors for space. This predation creates open spaces that inferior competitors can colonize, kind of like the resource partitioning that we talked about before. As a result, the diversity of species is high. High biodiversity is always better, y'all. In the absence of sea stars, the mussels dominate the surfaces of the intertidal rocks, and the diversity of species declines dramatically. Okay, so we want species diversity. We want to make sure that our mussel population does not go crazy. Okay, so this is the number of species present. The number of species drastically declines without our keystone sea stars, and the diversity is pretty high when we do have our keystone predator present. Okay. Now we also have this idea called ecosystems engineers, and they are these keystone species who create or maintain a habitat for others. All right. A couple of examples are going to be the North American beaver, and they build dams, as I'm sure you know, which ends up turning streams into ponds and creates this kind of new habitat for pond species. So not a lot of pond species are able to live in rivers because the water is moving too quickly. But if we kind of create a pond situation, then more species are able to move in. Okay, so if we look here, so it's still trickling out a little bit, so there is still some river happening, but it's kind of created this little retention pond in order for species who prefer quieter water to live. Okay, and then we also have woodpeckers. They poke holes in the sides of trees and create habitats for smaller creatures. And then alligators, they dig, they're called like alligator holes, and they end up being deep enough so that even if they go through a dry season, even if that habitat goes through a dry season, there will probably still be water in those alligator holes. All right. All right, now this is the end. Checkpoint questions are going to be on your WSQ chart, and I will see you tomorrow.